Thank you so much for joining us, Nick. For those of you who don't yet know him, Nic Marks is a statistician, happiness researcher, founder of Friday Pulse, creator of the Happy Planet Index, and author of Happiness is a Serious Business. He has spent decades challenging the idea that economic growth alone is the best measure of progress, and exploring how organizations, governments, and communities can create conditions where people genuinely thrive. His book, Happiness is a Serious Business, argues that happiness is not soft or frivolous. It's central to performance, resilience, and societal success. So I'd love to start out, Nick, by asking, how did you get into studying happiness?
Oh, it's kind of one of those random walks of life in that I'm a statistician. Well, I became a statistician. I was a really annoying guy at school that was top of maths without trying. And so I went to Cambridge to read maths and I didn't like it at all because it was very abstract. And I found out I liked solving problems with numbers. So I was an applied statistician. And then I did some work. And then my mother was a family therapist, and actually my dad was really into personal development work. And so I trained as a therapist in my 20s, which is the quirk. And then somewhere along the line, I started treating statistics a bit like therapy thinks about bringing into awareness for the client. I think of statistics as bringing into awareness. So how are we helping a system change, and how do we reflect back the numbers and listen to a population reflect it back? So it just sort of went down a wormhole. And then in 2001, which is now 25 years ago, I was doing a tiny bit of work for this think tank, New Economics Foundation, and it was about something else. And they challenged me saying the word well-being is coming into public policy. Nobody knows what it means. Maybe we should do some work on it. And I said, well, if I come and do it, I'd like to do measurement. And it started literally as a Friday job. I literally volunteered a day a week for a couple of years, managed to scrap some money together to get a first report, and then it snowballed. And so well-being then, became quite a major theme for particularly the Cameron government. Started in the Blair government, became for the Cameron, and then Cameron got the Office of National Statistics to do national measures of well-being. And I thought, okay, we've achieved what we could achieve in 10, 12 years of policy work. I'll go and work with businesses because people spend a lot of time at work. They're not very happy there, and it's aligned with business goals. And that's what I've been doing for the last 12 years. And I use happiness much more than well-being now because well-being is a little dead energetically as a word. It's become a little corporate and a little, and I think happiness is much more energetic. It's still a challenge, but I haven't come up with a better word. It's not engagement. So happiness. I sort of decided I'll just go with happiness, and here we are.
Yeah, wonderful. I resonate with your comment on being good at maths. It was always frustrating to me at school. If you the students who are best at maths spent the least time on their homework versus the students who are best at history, for example, probably also spent the most time on their homework. So there was a sort of injustice to it that I don't think I fully recovered from since. But I want to pick up on, so there's so much there to unpack, and we'll unpack all of it, the nation, business, everything. But your starting point, you're a statistician,
Yeah.
interested in well-being.
Mm.
Interesting that you even raised the question over what words to use, because in a
Yeah.
sense, there's a narrative around well-being, and now you're taking a statistical approach. So when we take a measurement-based statistical approach to well-being, what can be gained and what risk is there that something can be lost by that process?
If you say to someone, how is your well-being? Different people have immediate different connotations with that. Some are going to think very physically, some are going emotionally, psychologically. I mean, you can think of it in so many different ways. And so it's troublesome as a statistician to ask about something that you haven't got a clear construct with. So the way that most well-being indicators work is that they're multidimensional. And the best measure, I think, is probably called the Warwick Edinburgh Wellbeing Scale. And it measures functionality as well as feeling. So it asks people questions like, how are you doing with solving, I haven't got the word exactly right, but how are you doing with solving problems in your life at the moment? So I ask about your relationships, and it will ask about how you feel as well. So they sort of do a feeling and functioning is I think the best measures. And then there are so many different models with different dimensions and different approaches, and some of them, even though they are quite mainstream, I don't think are statistically strong. And there's a whole methodology in statistics which is called factor structures. You look at the underlying structure of the data, and they fail on those accounts. So I was just talking to a statistician about them the weekend. We hate the same scales. When it comes to happiness, the brilliant thing is we all know it. It's here. So I ask very simple questions like, how happy were you at work last week? And when you tighten it, so you've got a context work, you've got last week, so you're thinking about a period of time, the data becomes more and more robust and more useful. And you can do, and I do use longer questionnaires if I'm looking at what the drivers of it are. But if I'm measuring it, I try and keep it as simple as possible. But one of the things to realize is I'm working with organizations and teams. I'm not allocating public money. I'm not appealing to governments. And I think governments would be very worried about a single measure. But I think for pragmatic use in businesses and organizations, a simple trend line of whether happiness is going up and down is all you need to start the conversation. And if I go back to my therapy roots, you're trying to start a conversation for change, trying to help people change rather than measure it to two decimal places. I think it's much more important to have something useful, simple that people can use.
And one of our most recent gatherings was the economist John Kay. And he, among other things, it wasn't so much the focus of our conversation, but he wrote a book called Obliquity, in which he claimed that some of our for complex goals, it's very good to address them indirectly. And so, for example, he thinks businesses tend to succeed more when they don't aim to maximize their profits, but aim to be a really good business and deliver more value for their customers. And then they end up becoming a good business, seemingly accidentally. But happiness is another thing that he cites, where he says, happiness is something that's best achieved indirectly. And you think of characters like Madame Bovary in French literature, who tries to be happy the whole time, but fails as a result. So when we measure happiness, does that mean we're aiming for happiness directly, or is happiness a sort of indicator that we've hit the target on all of the things that cause happiness?
I mean, you've got to the root of all sorts of statistical questions there and philosophical ones. I really like. I wouldn't have known it was attributed to him, but I do like the idea of oblique goals very much. So we'll come back to that if we can do. With the measurement of happiness. So the way I think about it is if our inner and outer worlds are aligned, we feel good. So happiness in this sense is a measure of good fit. And in organizations, that's really important. And also it's dynamic. It's going to move all of the time. So I think of when I create measures of, I do say measures of happiness rather than measure happiness, because you are creating a measure of it. There's an old Chinese saying, the finger that points to the moon is not the moon. The indicators are indicators pointing towards something hopefully useful. So I create very simple indicators so that it acts like a mirror. People can see themselves. And then, and you're looking for this alignment. Now, people can be in our own lives and at work, we can be out of alignment for either inner world stuff or outer world stuff. Both of those are possible, and the happiness comes when they're both good, yeah, and aligned. That's when we've experienced that. But that tells us that unhappiness is functional, because unhappiness is signaling to us to create a change. Something's not right. So Madame Bovary, whatever she was, you can't be happy all the time. That would be dysfunctional. You'd be overriding signals from the world. So I think of it as very dynamic. And I think we should think about optimizing happiness at work rather than maximizing. And economists struggle with that as an indicator. So I tend to just create a green zone for my clients and say, when you're in a green zone, you're fine. So if you get 70 out of 100, it's just the way the scores work. Doesn't really matter now. You get a green, you do get a bright green for over 80, but I'm not suggesting it's functional to be 90 all the time. I actually think dips are good. They're sending you information. And when you've got a trend line, and you see this, resilience is the shape of the curve. There's a setback, but you bounce back. So you see that emerge in real time. So that's how I think of it as an indicator. And I don't think it's the only indicator you should measure, but I think it should be your top people indicator is how happy teams are. And I place quite a lot of emphasis on the teams, which could be the obliqueness, because I think if you go directly for individual happiness at work, I think it's much better to concentrate on the team and the relationships and how functional the team are. So in my book, there is a bit where I say, don't have a chief happiness officer, have a chief or head of team experience. Think of team experience rather than employee experience, because then you've got the bonding, you've got all of that relational bit that brings well-being and happiness. So I think oblique is good in that sense.
In several of our past gatherings, we have talked to people about alternatives to GDP and the need for useful indicators. And it feels like that is especially relevant right now when Keir Starmer is saying, there's growth, see, there's growth. And then everyone else is saying, but we're not feeling it. And it feels like GDP is broken as a useful indicator of the population feeling more prosperous. So what is actually a useful way of looking at what we can try and aim for as a country?
So my first published paper on alternative GDP is 1994. And that was with Professor Tim Jackson, who you've had on the show, I think. So you've had him on. I worked with Tim quite a lot in the 90s. So I've not been a fan of GDP for a long time. The indicator that Tim and I did then was called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. It became called the Measure of Domestic Progress. Tim's continued to do a lot of work on it. And it's really a big, huge cost benefit analysis of the economy. And it's got many, many moving parts, and it does create a line. But for me, the line doesn't mean very much at the end because there's so many assumptions in all those moving parts. So I rather gave up on the ISCW in the late 90s. I didn't quite, because I did some work with some what they call regional development agencies. Does anyone remember those? I did some work with them on it, but it wasn't my favorite indicator, and I prefer the simplicity of having a measure of people's direct experience. So GDP is an objective measure, though hidden in GDP is all sorts of qualitative stuff, but it's very hidden. I mean, that actually, how do you measure, output from a school? How do you measure quality in delivery of services? So, there's all sorts of really, really difficult questions underneath GDP. However, it's an established methodology. And the thing with GDP, there's a couple of things which I think are really interesting about GDP. One is this one number that goes up and down. I think that's a real clue to what we need. I'm not a fan of basket of indicators approach, because if some go up and some go down, how do you do that? So I think we should look at the thorny questions of trade-offs and complementarities if we're doing that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, if GDP goes down, it's actually shit. Pardon my French. It's actually, we might not notice GDP being stable, but we do notice it if things shrink. We see people get made unemployed. We see inflation going up. We experience those things. So there is a way that GDP does have some resonance with people's lives. We might not notice 0.3% of growth, but you would notice 0.3% shrinking or 0.5% shrinking. So there is something it's capturing in there. And there's all sorts of problems with per capita and inequalities and whatever. So there's some value to GDP. I mean, I prefer measures of experience. If you'd had measures of people's experience of life, you would have seen Brexit coming because people were unhappy. They were voting for some sort of change. Clearly, in my opinion, they attached it to the wrong thing, but the how, the protest, was valid. So why did we not have good measures that politicians saw that coming, and why didn't they address it? The Remain vote just remained in the economic argument. The Leave was very emotional. Why didn't the Remain have an emotional argument? Like, think of your children traveling around Europe and the love we have for our European cousins and how these are our brothers and sisters that we have, and how we really want to avoid having a war again, and we don't want all of that. They didn't make any of those emotional arguments. They just said it would be better economically, and it didn't win. So I think there is a lesson that actually politicians, and I'm quite hopeful about Andy Burnham, if he can get in, that he will take us more back into a well-being space again. I mean, Keir Starmer's got some sound bites about it that's done nothing, but really ever since Cameron made his fatal errors, we haven't really had well-being on the agenda.
It's interesting because Andy Burnham, funnily enough, is also a former guest and I remember that the average lifespan in the Greater Manchester City region has increased as a result of his policies in a way that has been independently verified. The study was nothing to do with Andy. It was a very prestigious. I forget, I think it was the Lancet that published the study. And what was really interesting about that is for average life expectancy to increase as a result of his policies, that meant that the life expectancy of people who would have had artificially shortened lives through poverty, for example, the impact was disproportionately great for them. They were for it to have an effect of a noticeable effect on the total population meant the effect on people whose life expectancy was artificially short was really strong. And one of our other former guests, Mark Fabian, has talked about the need to shift from a welfare state to a well-being state. And it would be really interesting to see if Andy, with more deliberative, participatory, relationship building approaches, could get us there.
This question kind of goes back to what we had before when we were talking about happiness in businesses. And I know you were talking about the importance of having a single indicator like GDPS. Yeah. But I'm conscious that with happiness, there's different types of happiness. And I wonder if you try to capture them. So, for example, I might be happy because I'm really ambitious about the direction this team is going, or I might be happy because I feel like relaxed and it's quite easy. So I wonder if there's a way of capturing different types of happiness and trying to interpret what the type of happiness as well as the level of happiness means.
I mean, there is all sorts of academic work on this, and I've certainly read a lot of it and certainly looked at multidimensional models. The typical tension is between pleasure and meaning. That, pleasure is sort of quite immediate, and meaning is longer term narrative led. So pleasure is feeling and immediate. Meaning is more narrative, cognitive, longer term. I think they're both happiness. I think that basically happiness has different wavelengths. So we can have very immediate wavelengths of happiness, like like light, and we can have very long wave ones. So that's the way that I think about it. Now, with measurement, I've certainly done work, a lot of work in the 2000s on what was called eudaimonic well-being, which was this the idea. Word comes from Aristotle, and it's basically the life well lived. So I was a big fan of that. And it's called hedonic well-being, which is more immediate and more pleasure oriented. So that's kind of the way to split it. I used to make quite an argument we should have both. In the workplace, I don't worry about meaning too much. I mean, I have it there in my drivers. So I have 5 drivers of team happiness, which are connect, relationships, be fair, empower, which is like autonomy, challenge, which is about stretch, and then inspire, which gets into meaning and purpose. And they're all drivers of people's overall happiness or weekly happiness. So I think of it as a driver at work, and I am going for simplicity, and I'm going for how do you support team leaders, because that's where the cold face of it is. And I think things like the personal development at work. So are you getting good feedback? Are you setting learning goals and doing them? They play into the meaning part of it. I don't measure them separately because I want a very dynamic indicator and I want a simple indicator. And as soon as you introduce, it's not to say I think they're wrong, but as soon as you introduce multi-dimensions, you get into the question of weights, you get into how you weight those different indicators, and that opens up a debate. People start arguing about them and everything like that. So there's a really neat simplicity to just going, how happy were you at work this week? Were you unhappy? Were you okay? Were you happy? If I use 5, but it's sort of unhappy, okay. And what's very, very interesting about that is a good, bad signal. When people are unhappy, something needs to change. When they feel happy, they've got the energy. It's very energetic, positive to create and seize opportunities. The middle point, okay, is really interesting, because it's quite dead energetically. I mean, the unhappy, there's energy. It might be disruptive. It might be they leave, like unhappy are very likely to leave the organization. They're 9 times more likely to leave the organization than the happy in the next quarter. The okay are twice as likely than the happy, but only twice. They're 9 times more. So the unhappy are are active. The okay can persist. So actually, I've started saying, and it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's not, that okay is probably the most expensive word in business because they underperform, but they stay. So there's a complexity to it. And I try and err to simplicity so it can be acted on rather than getting it, there's a whole academic literature which does that, all that complexity.
Brilliant answer. Yeah, I love that idea of okay being the most expensive word in business. That's great. I'll reuse that.
Yeah, I've just had because I'm now 60 and I want to do more speaking, more masterclasses and less running of my business. My business partner's running the business. And so I've just had a show reel done and it's really jazz hands because that's what you kind of need to do. And I work with this Dutch filmmaker and he was coming, he was filming, he was going to, the main part of the clip is from one talk in Amsterdam that he filmed. I had two cameras and we could get sort of make it look all cool, right? But he sent me to a hairdresser that morning. He got my thing also, but he fed me lines, right? And he knew my work and interviewed me before. And he said, I think the best line you've had is okay is the most expensive word in business. I think we should make that the show reel. So he really got me to focus on. So he almost fed me lines, and we got to this bit where I can go that okay. Twice as likely to leave, 3 times more likely to get burnt out, and 4 times more likely to miss their goals. So 2, 3, 4. So he got me very snappy, but I do think that is kind of, I'm in a communication game. I'm trying to persuade people to take it seriously, and I think it needs to be clear and memorable to do that. I presented at the weekend at a conference here in Portugal. That's why I'm in an Airbnb and not my office. And in the audience is Professor Jean Emmanuel Deneve, which if you know Wellbeing, he's like world class. And he's in the audience. And I've obviously got experience, but I thought, oh my God, Jean Emmanuel's there, anyway. So luckily he laughed and he liked it. And he liked the fact that I dared to introduce beta coefficients into a public talk. But I taught people through it. So I think I'm a good communicator of some difficult stats sometimes. And I think that's where I add it. And I think, to create change, you have to, stories and clarity, I think, are really important.
And for anyone who hasn't read the book, I highly recommend it. It's very easy to get through. It's a thick book, but it's a very quick read and it's very practical as well. So anyone leading teams definitely should read it. And I think doing the questionnaires for yourself is also very useful.
I'm finding this fascinating, Nic, so I'm definitely going to be going out and getting the book. But I wanted to ask, from your research and the organisations that you've worked with in the past, do you find that is there like a universal or a common driver of happiness, or are there differences, like between men and women or ages or where you live? Like if you were in a company saying, and we've read the book and we've all gone, Nic, he's absolutely knocked it out of the park. We totally believe this. We want to improve happiness in this organisation. Is it one thing or 3 things that you need to do that would appeal to everybody? What are your thoughts on that?
I do think there are sort of universal families of drivers. So the way I call it is what I said, the 5 ways to team happiness. So connect, relationships, treating people fairly, empowering them, challenge, inspiring them. And I focus on that because that is within the power of a team and a team leader. And my main focus is on team happiness, how you improve it. And the reason I focus on team happiness is that team culture is the biggest driver of people's experience, not overall organizational culture. Basically, in any organization, there's lots of microcultures. Okay. And so teams have their own culture. They can be similar. And if you've got a good organization, they'll ensure that all team leaders, are good coaches, are good listeners, have good people skills. But in many, the majority, it's sink or swim. You're promoted for technical skills, for length of service, not for people skills, which is madness in my opinion, because the people skills are what drive the experience and also drive performance. So there are universal, but then there's lots of individuality because it's all about good fit. That's where happiness is. So yes, you're unlikely to be a good fit if you hate your teammates. You're unlikely to be a good fit if you're not appreciative of your work. You're unlikely to be a long-term good fit if your work-life balance is out of skew for too long. For too long. Of course, we can do peaks, but if it's too long, most people trail away. But you also can be not a good fit for, just your skills to the job, which is really nothing to do, that's to do with recruitment, it's to do with what you're doing. You can be not a good fit because you're bored. Actually, boredom is probably so underestimated as a negative at work. In my data, boredom is, well, okay, let me ask you. Okay, boredom is worse than stress. How much worse than stress it is? Do you think it's 50% worse? Double? Put your fingers up to how many times worse do you think boredom is than stress? Give me a visual. One, two, 7 times worse. That's bold. 5 times worse. You're not far off, by the way. It's 4 times worse, right? And when I was doing a talk recently in an NHS area, they do a stress audit. I said, you should do a boredom audit. That would pick up what's going wrong in the organization much more than a stress audit. So, and boredom is like an interesting thing. It's actually a bit like the okay you get stuck in. I think boredom is a symptom of being stuck in okay often. Yeah, there's very little productivity with boredom. Yeah. It depends on what the job is. Actually, all of this does depend on what the job is. If a job is there's a very famous piece of research on call centers and looking at the mood of call operators. It's with British Telecom, is by Professor Jean-Marc Deneve, who was just talking about. Anyway, they measured the happiness and the number of sales these BT call operators did each week. And they showed that happiness increased sales, and they actually showed that causally. But the point I want to make here is that they looked at different types of calls that the operators did, from simple order taking through to dealing with unhappy customers who needed a complete renegotiation of their contract. Happiness didn't matter for the order taking, it had no impact. But on the complex, relational, difficult ones, it had a very big impact. So the more complex, the more relational, the more collaborative role is, the more important happiness is, and the more important boredom will undermine it.
Part of one thought that occurs to me, if you think of a startup operating in a very turbulent environment, for example, is that whoever's leading that has to work so hard just to keep jobs alive for their team. And I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I don't know if that's the cause, but there is a sort of trend of thinking that well-being and happiness is something that you think about once you've got the basics covered, as if they're in opposition. And one difficulty with that is sometimes you have to do things that are not in line with your immediate well-being. If you had a close family member having an operation, you'd stay up all night, and even because there is a bigger issue. And I just wonder in turbulent times and difficult times, if we need to think differently about happiness and well-being for them to be taken seriously, and also for them seen as something that comes after other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just there's quite a lot in that, all of that. Firstly, you've got Maslow. Even Maslow took down the hierarchy at the end of his career. It persists as an idea because there's something roughly right about it, and it's a neat thing, and everybody uses it. But even he at the end of his career said he shouldn't have put it as a hierarchy. And I think that needs, if we want to think of needs like that, I did a lot of work on needs in the 90s. I think you need to think of them as systems. And Maslow inadvertently has caused a lot of damage in development economics, because development economics has gone basic needs matter, calories, water. We don't care about culture. We don't care. We don't care about that. We will, as long as we're making some economic activity, your basic needs will be met, and the rest we can think about later. And they've decimated, thousands of years of indigenous cultures in pursuit of a very narrow goal. And I think that's the problem you get when you start thinking that higher goals come later. I don't believe that. I think they're all there all the time. If I used to work with a development economist in Chile, and he talked about this transformative experience he had traveling in a bus through Chile, and you stop at somewhere for a pee break and a coffee break, and then this little lad came in. I think he had cigarettes or matches on a tray, and he went down the whole thing, and he didn't sell any, and he went back out again. And Ricardo looked out the window and he saw the young boy, having made no sales, so got no neck on it, just rearrange everything beautifully on his tray. And he couldn't understand how someone so poor appreciated beauty. It was such a shock to him. He was a trade unionist at the time. And he just said, it just made me realize how ignorant I was of what motivates people. This boy was 7, 8, and he was just doing something beautiful for the sake of it, for nothing else, and just, he hadn't sold anything, was waiting for the next bus. And I think we throw away more than we realize if we go the basic needs in the Maslow hierarchy. There was another part to your question which I've completely forgotten now, but so you'll have to re-ask me. There was something else I wanted to pick up on as well, but
Hi Nick, how you doing?
good, thank you.
Good to see you again. Yeah, two questions, quite short.
Yeah.
The first one is on the politics and the GDP.
Yeah.
Do you think if a government or party was to say, actually, we're going to focus on happiness and GDP will be a net output of that, that would actually go down well? And the second one was on the social media side.
Can I deal with the first one first? Because I never hold the second question.
Fair
And then
enough. Go with it.
you write down that because I haven't got a pen and paper here. I think that people are unlikely to get on the streets and ask for more happiness and more well-being. I think probably we need to look at ill-being, loneliness. I think loneliness is like a really emotive subject which brings out empathy. Sort of low happiness, people think, but lonely really strikes chord. So I think we should think much more. So actually, going back to what Paul said earlier about Andy Burnham, it's the poorest, it's the most isolated that had the most benefit from some well-being policies, and we should target them there. I think we should target them there, and so I don't know exactly what the rallying call is, but in my book, it's loneliness. It's sort of like we're becoming more isolated. How community's gone? What do we do about that? High street's gone now. Surely there's an opportunity to do more connection in the high street rather than just have charity shops. Isn't there something we can do with, public money that creates hubs for people to meet? I remember when I was at New Economics Fund, there used to be called Biz Fizz or something. Anyway, it was a little project, and it was community coaches to help people start little businesses. And you invest in coaches, you get much better return than if you invest in a building something new and wants a new community centre. Actually, what you need is the people part of it. And I think for kids, I think we should be absolutely investing in youth clubs. I mean, what on earth are we doing? Abandoning them to social media, to porn, to whatever. Have every single town have a sports club, a music club, a board game club, whatever it is they want to play, so that they interact with other people. Because that's the relationships are the absolute hub of well-being and happiness, and we just let them disappear. And there was an amazing example, which is Iceland. Iceland had the highest level of heroin addiction amongst teenagers 30, 40 years ago, and they put in a whole set of policies which were around community clubs and youth clubs and parenting. What happens later? Iceland get to the semi-final of the European Cup because they're a tiny nation. You get Bjork, you get this amazing music scene come out of Iceland. That is the investment in youth clubs they made 25, 30 years ago. And we should do that. That should be that. I think young people is very inspiring for voters. And I think, for most voters, obviously not the older reform voting group. I don't know what they're doing. But for a lot of people, concentrate on the young and the least fortunate in society, and you've probably got some consensus, I think.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And the second one was really short. So you could say like social media become quite negative. People are always having, we're worried about kids kind of like being bullied and all these kind of things. Obviously, there's the dopamine thing about links. With the advent of AI, something that's coming up is that we'll be talking to bots who are quite sycophantic. We're never wrong. They're always nice to us.
Yeah.
That So if we're moving into this world of having sycophantic friends who are always being nice to us, what polaric effect, as opposed to the nastiness of people telling you you're rubbish on social media, how will that affect our happiness?
Um, I think authenticity is kind of where well-being and happiness is at.
Hmm.
And I think it's probably taking us quite a while to catch up with the inauthentic nature of AI positivity. I think it's starting to be talked. I mean, I certainly didn't notice it. I just thought I was brilliant and it was telling me I was brilliant. And then you realize it's telling everybody. And it's like, and you know, and then you play with things. I mean, I've got AI therapists really because I wanted to look at it, see how they work. And I have to work very hard to get therapy out of it. And I'm a trained therapist. I know what I'm looking for. And actually, you know, you get quite a lot of just sort of unconditional positive regard is what Carl Rogers would call it. There's quite a lot of, you know, there's mirroring there, but it's sort of like, oh, you're brilliant and everyone else is terrible. And it's like, well, no, actually, I need the challenge. So there's something about authenticity and challenge and that I think is really, really important to growth. And um, I think, and we are quite exquisite at picking up inauthenticity person to person in the real world. I think we just feel it. We don't really know why. And we even sometimes don't trust ourselves. But normally, I mean, it can be your biases and it may be your biases, but there's something going on, either your internal or external world with that. And online, we're missing those signals. You know, it's better here. We've got face to face with most of you. I know, and I am doing it today. I stand up when I talk online because I have more energy, more ever. But so I think the physicality of being in someone's presence is very, very important. So I hope we will have a backlash and we will go back more in person. And I think we need we need school support for that. We need all sorts of things to do that. But that would be my hope, that it just feels inauthentic and we create. I mean, live music is becoming more popular. Live experiences, okay, we maybe less so with Money Titan at the moment, but you know, going to Glastonbury is very different than watching it on the BBC iPlayer. It's a very, very different experience. And I think people are craving more live experiences. As we become richer, it tends to be where our spare pounds go. Well, whether we become richer or not, that housing's got a whole to do. That's not a good influence on wealth. I mean, income, spending power. So I hope we go more to experience, but and we can create better experiences for people. Yeah.
In the book, I noticed that your sector-wide study showed
Yeah.
that marketing and advertising was happiest sector, and I was a little surprised. Do you know what factors have led to that? Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, in my sample sizes, they're quite small, but I've seen it across the 30 or 40 population surveys I've done. Always creative industries, marketing, advertising come out. Now, there's quite a lot piled sometimes into that sector, and there will be huge differences. But if people are close to customers and working in teams on projects which are creative, then and they get feedback on that, so then they tend to be happier. I mean, hairdressing is famously a really happy profession, and people go, "That's ridiculous." Well, no, they are using creative skills. They are doing something with immediate impact that they get positive feedback on. They're talking to people, they're on their feet, and they've got exercise. You know, so there's lots of really, really good things about that you know that you wouldn't think. Most statisticians and policy people are university educated, and you know we're in a bubble. But actually, it's, you know, when we see work like gardeners and a lot of work that's outside, you know, builders and plumbers are often very happy because they see immediate impact of their work. I hardly ever see immediate. No, that's not quite true. When I do a talk, I do, but it's like, you know, there's lots of work you do. You never, you sort of, you think you've had an impact. You don't know they do. So I can't remember where I started about that, but that's what I said. Sorry, my brain's obviously really slippy today.
No, we are a very challenging group.
No.
And I want to pick up and go a little further with that, because the observation was, you know, that marketing and the creative industry are proportionately happy.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of your work, this phase of your work, as
Yeah.
we've um, so many dimensions of your work over the years, is focusing on employee happiness. And of course, a business has a massive impact on the well-being of its employees because people spend so much of their time at work.
Mm-hmm.
But when we have our marketing hats on, we care a lot about customers.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give marketers who start to have the sense that maybe if they're in marketing, they should make sure that what they are proposing to their customers will be a contributor to their well-being and happiness rather than a deductor? So what advice could you give somebody with that mindset?
Sorry, my mind's going into sort of the ethics of all sorts of stuff where, where we have this addiction economy where people sell things for engagement, for coming back for something else rather than for the satisfaction or the happiness. And one of the problems with happiness and well-being is that people would buy less stuff because they wouldn't be filling a void if they were happier. So there's a real challenge to the whole capitalist society from it. And I think so if you took it really seriously, I mean, in my very early days, I'm in my 20s and I once said I thought the biggest evil in the world was advertising. And when the internet came, it was the first quote you get from me. Luckily, it's buried massively away now. But the point with it really is that there's a lot of creating a false need in order to sell a product in advertising. And of course, that's bad advertising. There's lots of massively brilliant advertising that places something in front of my nose that I never knew I wanted and I really do want, and it will help me. So I just think there's a spectrum with it. And I think that is about awareness and it's about values of the agency. What I do know is that it's more rewarding to work on projects you think are worthwhile. It's more rewarding for the individual to work on something they feel is doing good in the world than not. And so, sometimes it's called emotional labor when you sort of like have to get involved in something that you don't believe in, and that is very tiring on you. And actually, think about the charity sector; they pay less because people want to do the work. That is sort of that's a market inefficiency, perversity really. They're doing work that's more social value, but they get paid less for it personally because we assume they're going to feel good about the fact that they're doing that work. I mean, it works. That's how the market works. We see it happening all the time. And that is a perversion really, because does that mean we have to pay people more to do unethical things and we have to pay people less to do ethical things? I mean, so how does that work? It's like that's like flying uses much more carbon than a train, but it's 5 times as cheap because you have to build train tracks in the sky. You just once you take off, you just got 2 bits of infrastructure, so it's cheaper, but no tax on aviation fuel, all sorts of things. So I think you kind of got to try and get pricing and wages aligned with social value, and I think that's really hard. We're a long way away from it as a market.
I'd love to hear more about your work at Friday Pulse. In the book, you talk about the measure, meet, repeat. It'd be great to hear more about what you're doing with clients and teams every week.
So basically, when I said that question, how happy were you at work this week? That's the question I use with teams and organizations because it creates a very dynamic up and down line and it brings into awareness the team experience every week. But when I put it into practice, I say, this has to become a habit. And so it's measure, meet, repeat. And meet is the hardest bit to get our clients to do. The measure is getting people to answer a little short pulse survey every Friday. That's why we call Friday Pulse. The meet is we do provide the data to the team leaders, but do they actually sit down and meet? Do they actually talk about it? We're not so controlling, but that's the most important part of it. And what I say really is that team happiness, it needs sort of you need to do a little and often rather than a lot. So what tends to happen often is we'll have a Christmas party or we'll have a this, or we do something occasionally which might be expensive and long and whatever. Actually what you really need is 15 minutes a week to go, what's gone well this week? What's gone well? Too many team leaders start with what's your problem, what your challenge is. No, you've got what's gone well, and then notice that accomplishment. And yes, we've cut because people we don't look back. We finish on a Friday, Monday, new set of goals, and it's like it's exhausting. And actually, just to take that moment to appreciate your team and what they're achieving is a massive well-being intervention. The other thing I really encourage people to do is to thank each other for support. That's called positivity resonance in the field, but basically you're spreading things and you're acknowledging people, you're appreciating them. So, I say don't leave gratitude diaries by your bed. Act out the gratitude in the day. Say thank you. So thank your peers, thank your customers, thank your suppliers, thank your bosses. That's always a radical one, but do thank them if they've done something good for you. So that is really good. And then only then in the team meeting come to anything frustrating, anything holding you back, because there's all sorts of friction in systems in organizations, and they not only undermine productivity, they undermine happiness, because we like achieving goals. That's a natural human thing. We like it, if you're a certain type of person, and there's a lot of us, we like solving difficult problems together. We like that. Difficult problems together is a good thing, as long, and that's motivating. So there's no mismatch between happiness and success, but you have to sort of get it right. And I think what you have to do is mark your ways along the way. Like a top sports person won't just think about the Olympic gold. They will think about their training goals, their resting goals, everything along the way. And they will notice that they do them well. And we need to bring that more into the workplace, not have annual one-to-ones where we should be doing this every week, little and often.